Penguin Random House Audio presents The Barrowfields by Phillip Lewis. Read for you by MacLeod Andrews. Oh, brothers, like our fathers in their time, we are burning, burning, burning in the night. Thomas Wolfe. You Can't Go Home Again. Prologue. The desk is the same as he left it, the raven or whatever it is on the wall. Wolfe, Poe, Chopin. A first edition copy of The Stranger, price-clipped, chipped, and cocked. A signed first edition of Look Homeward, Angel, that he prized more than any other book. A first edition of Tales of Mystery and Imagination signed by Harry Clarke in blood-red ink. A Bible, King James, black leather cover. 3 candles. Copious spent wax. A bottle of Hill's absinthe, empty. 2 bottles of vodka, empty. A bottle of Spanish wine, also empty. A book of matches, a lamp, no bulb. 51 journals, handwritten. The title page of an unpublished novel with an annotation in Latin. 9 years of collected dust and a handful of pictures that must have meant something to him. I opened The Stranger to read the inscription in my own hand. I turn the page and see the first line of the book. Mother died today. I am beginning to understand. Part 1. Chapter 1. My father was one of only 2 children born in Old Buckram's cinder block hospital in the cold and bitter autumn of 1939. The other child, a young boy who didn't live long enough to get a name or a soul to be saved, was buried by his mother on a hillside near town, when the ground warmed enough to dig him a proper grave. There was no service, and no one sang any hymns. The boy's headstone, if you could call it that, was a large smooth rock from the creek. He was laid to rest with only his mother's voiceless prayer to an absent God. She asked that he be forgiven the original sin, and kindly allowed into heaven to await the others when, in the Lord's wisdom, their day should come. Old Buckram, where this story begins, is an achromatic town high in the belly of the Appalachian Mountains. It's situated uneasily about as far north and west as you can go and still be inside the surveyed boundaries of North Carolina. In 1799, the population there was 125. And by 1939, this number had swelled to 400. It's a town where the streets and sidewalks are lonely and seldom traveled, where the few paltry shops, an aging hardware store, a feed store, a cobbler, a discount clothier, a cafe, and a headstone maker scarcely see enough business for a living and close early in the dark days of winter before the snow falls. It's an old railroad town, but the train hasn't gone there in years. It's a town with one-room red-brick churches on the hillsides and in the hollows, a town that believes in a God living but remote, and a town with one funeral home that buries almost all the dead. It's a town of ghosts and superstitions. It has the Devil's Stairs and Serpent's Tongue Rock and Abaddon Creek, which carried an entire family into oblivion in the flood of 1916. Up behind the creek at the edge of town lay the Barrowfields, where by some mystery nothing of natural origin will grow except a creeping gray moss, which climbs over mounds of rock and petrified stumps that the more credulous locals believe are grave markers from an age before time. Others say a great wind blow came up over the mountains 1,000 years ago and ripped out the trees and carried away all the goodness in the soil so that nothing could ever grow there again. Nearly everyone thinks it's haunted ground. There's never been a picnic on the Barrowfields, of that you can be sure. If anyone ever knew how my father's family found themselves there in Old Buckram, their stories have long since been silenced by many steady turns of the imperturbable clock, and no record of that enigmatic journey has been left behind. My grandfather, whose given name was Helton, told me once that the family might have migrated there from the far north sometime in the 1700s, down the Great Wagon Road that ran from Pennsylvania to the North Carolina Piedmont. He said our ancestors were probably some of the first settlers on this rugged and unforgiving land. "Goes to show," he told me, "that my and your daddy's folks were none too smart." The family was damn poor, impossibly poor, like almost everyone else in the mountains, but over time, through hard work and determination, they managed to cultivate a fairly dignified existence. The children were well cared for, even if food and clothes were hard to come by. Helton was a laborer who would take whatever work there was and do it honestly and diligently without complaint, except for whatever he might have said to God on Sunday mornings during prayer. He worked for several years on the Blue Ridge Parkway as a dynamiter for the WPA, and after some time had lost his hearing in one ear and was immune to most conversation that was conducted in his presence. He became somewhat like an old dog that sits quietly in the corner of the room, oblivious to all the goings-on around him. I know of nothing extraordinary that he did in his life, except that he worked 5 days a week and remained married to my grandmother, Madeline, despite uncountable bitter winters and unrelenting poverty. He accumulated no money and no property of consequence. On the date of his death, he owned nothing of real value other than a middling farmhouse that leaned when the wind blew, and a plot of fit-for-nothing land he'd purchased at auction for $5 an acre. The only book he ever owned or read was the Holy Bible, which came to me when he passed away. On the first blank page of parchment there is a note from his father, my great-grandfather, William, that says in barely legible scrawl, "Read this Bible and govern yourself accordingly." The next page contains a faded reproduction of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane by Heinrich Hoffmann. My grandfather signed the Bible and over time wrote into its pages several annotations of unknown provenance, the first of which appears at the beginning of the book of Genesis. It reads simply, 4004 B.C. For him, this is when time began. Despite living in Old Buckram his entire life, my grandfather appeared in the local newspaper only once. Against his better judgment, he ran for office after being encouraged to do so by the pastor of his church, who regarded Helton as a quiet man with common sense and decency. Confusingly, after a brief political campaign during a frigid autumn, he wound up with only 2 votes out of the 25 that were cast. The newspaper reported only a sentence. T. Van Noy of Vellam's-Cask defeated H. L. Aster for the open seat of county commissioner by a wide margin. Knowing that he'd voted for himself, he'd only say later that it made him trust both his wife and his preacher a good deal less. The next day, before he went into town, he took great pains to clean and ready his gun, a fact that was observed with silent concern by everyone in the family. To hear Mattie tell it, he stood from the table and inserted the pistol with significant gravity of movement into his belt. At long last, she said, "Helton, where in tarnation are you going with that gun?" He said, "I figure a man that's got no more friends than I do would be wise to protect himself." Whereupon he closed the door behind him and walked the long road into town. He never ran for another office, and no one ever suggested to him that he should. As a boy, I used to ride with my grandfather in his rusted Ford pickup truck to the Buckram Abattoir north of town, some days after school and on some weekends. On the main level, the store sold bacon, sausage, vegetables, and various other subsistence items. Out behind the store was a large cement slab with 4 crudely cut channels running to a black drain. On the sign in the front was a black and white hog. At the Buckram Abattoir, everybody knew everybody. My grandfather and I went in one Friday afternoon to buy milk, and a giant man in overalls approached my grandfather and slapped him on the back. He said, "Helton, what do you know?" My grandfather said, "What do I know? Hell, I don't even suspect anything." The man in the overalls smiled and winked at me kindly. Outside, men with no work to do sat on benches for hours and told jokes and picked at their teeth with toothpicks and watched people come and go. Inside, men idled on straight-backed chairs with seats of woven hickory slats and leaned open-mouthed over checkerboards, lifting their heads
Sample complete. Ready to continue?